So faith in the face of offensiveness. Now, this is a side of Jesus that we don't often think about. And so my passage for today is just Mark chapter 6 and just the first 5.5 verses. What this says to me about Jesus, I suppose, in summary, just at the start, is he is human. He's human, and we'll, as we look at this passage, maybe this might, it's not the point I'm going to make, but it's just think about what it must have been like for him, because I would like to enter into his journey today. So I'm going to read the passage. I'm going to read it from the NLT. The text I'm using is the NIV on the slides, but I'll just read this. So I'm reading from Mark chapter 6 and just verses 1 to 6a. Jesus left that part of the country and returned with his disciples to Nazareth, his hometown. The next Sabbath he began teaching in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. They asked, "Where did he get all this wisdom and the power to perform such miracles?" Then they scoffed. "He's just a carpenter, the son of Mary and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas and Simon. And his sisters live right here among us." They were deeply offended and refused to believe in him. Then Jesus told them, "A prophet is honoured everywhere except in his own hometown and among his relatives and his own family." And because of their unbelief, he couldn't do any miracles among them except to place his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Sort of chokes you up a bit reading that. So I want to just, in talking about this, I've just got an outline there as to what I want to talk about today. Basically, we're going to talk about Nazareth. He was called Jesus of Nazareth quite a lot, wasn't he? You know, and you think, okay, why was he called Jesus of Nazareth? Well, this might explain just a few things, because we're just going to look at a bit of background. We've read the hometown reaction that we can see, and we'll talk about that a bit. And I just want to make the point, and this is with the help of Tim Keller, the world is offended by Jesus and his disciples, and then the response that Jesus gives. Okay, so that's what we're sort of going to be talking about. I've changed it slightly from the slide. So, Jesus of Nazareth. The first verse that we read in Mark chapter 6 and verse 1, Jesus left there and went to his hometown accompanied by his disciples. Now, think of Nazareth. I mean, you look at Nazareth today and you see a big city, and there's all churches there to prove that Jesus was there at some time and that Mary lived there and all that sort of thing. But I want to just get this whole sort of background picture, because Nazareth was in Galilee. Now, I've got to pick this up. And so we're talking about this area. There's the Sea of Galilee there, and this area here was Galilee in the times of Jesus. Okay, you got that there? Now, the rest of Israel was down here. So Jerusalem's down there somewhere, down here. That's it, round about there, is it? Or a bit further down? Yeah, okay. All right, mine's a bit smaller there. Now, in between is this whole area of Samaria. And I think you'll understand from the history that the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans, because they were a mixed breed of people that had sort of got together. There were some Jews who'd married some other people who'd been brought out by the Assyrians in early years. And so they were a bit untouchable, you know. Now here we've got, so down here we've got all the big city people, if I can just get that thing right there, the big city people down here, you know, the pure Jews, and down here. And then you've got Samaria. And then you've got the Galilee, which is up here. It's a backwater. And it's a mixture of Gentiles and Jews and fishermen and farming communities. And it's not the big smoke. It's the bush. And it's wild country in a few places. And so Jesus is from Nazareth. Now, that's in Lower Galilee. And I don't know whether you can see it literally there on the map, but there's Nazareth that I'm pointing to. Okay, and so just get that picture. Now, I was reading some things about it just fairly recently, actually. I looked online and I came up with this archaeologist whose name is Yardena Alexandre, who is an archaeologist in Israel at the moment. And in 2020, she put an article into the Times of Israel. And she was talking about what Nazareth was like in the times of Jesus, because she and others had been doing a dig in that area. And she's saying that the town population was about 400 people. 400 people, just a few families who were doing some farming and just carrying on with their basic lives, and maybe doing a little bit of sheep farming as well. And so that was the Nazareth that Jesus grew up in. Now just think about that. They're sort of hayseeds. They're just a farming community, and they're sort of, I'm from sort of West Sydney, and so they're sort of bogan, and I think we all understand so you probably don't understand that. You'd have to come over my way to find out. But anyhow, they're just sort of basic people. There's no main roads going through Nazareth. It's a side road that you have to take to get in there. And this is where Jesus not necessarily was born, but where he grew up. Now, just get that picture. I mean, he's growing up in that particular area with 400 or so families. And so he was there for 30 years in that backwater, just growing up. And we have some things that we could learn about him. But about the reputation of Nazareth, I've got it on the slide there, that, when Philip goes to Nathaniel down in the big smoke and sort of, tells him about Jesus, and Nathaniel turns to him and says, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" Now, he knew, because where's Cana, where he came from? Hey, it's up here in Galilee, and it's about 10k from where Jesus lived. And so just get that background, get the picture of what's going on here. We've just got a bunch of country folk who are living out in the scrub in a back paddock area, a few bits of farming going on, a bit of sheep going on, and here we've got the local carpenter. And he was there for 30 years. And so he goes back there. He goes back to his hometown. Now, this is the country boy made good and coming back. It's a few years. He's gone down got baptised, gone out in the wilderness, was tempted, and then he's calling his disciples together and gathering them, and then he's doing some ministry. Probably for 12 months he's been doing his ministry. And in this, but not in the Luke case, but in this case, he's coming back home. He's coming back home to his place. And so the initial reaction of his hometown. Now the passage is only 6 verses, and so there's a couple of words that we want to focus on. The one word that I want to focus on here is that word "amazed" in the passage, because the English doesn't help us very well with that. But I put some other words up there that basically say what the response is from all of his yokel mates in the town. They are affronted by him. Now, when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many heard him were affronted. They were baffled. They were mystified. They were stumped. And I want to make the point, he stirred up their prejudices. And that's the point that I want to carry through, and it sort of comes from what Tim Keller writes about in his talks on this, Mark 6. So he stirred up their prejudices. And if you wonder, man, what is going on? And so anyhow, we'll move on. And the locals there, 400 odd people, one would assume, sit around and talk to each other and say, "Hey, what's going on with this bloke? Who is he? What's happening?" And so their reaction is not, wow, let's put up a banner. Our boy has made good down at the Big Smoke, and he's come back, and it's wonderful, you know. Look at him. He's one of us. Where did this man get these things, they asked. What's this wisdom that's been given him? What are these remarkable miracles he's performing? And it's done in a scoffing way. That's the sense of it. It's done in a scoffing way. And so they go on and they assess his hometown credentials. Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son? What happened to Joseph? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of da-da-da-da? Aren't his sisters all here with us? He's just a carpenter. He's just a human carpenter. That's all he is. Just a tradie, an artisan. I can say just a trader because I'm a tradie, okay? Not a problem. Here with all you boffins. Now, there's a little bit of significance, they reckon, in the Mary's son bit, because they're not too sure about the parentage of Jesus. You know, his mum was pregnant before they got married, and we know that story. And so isn't this Mary's son? Because we're not quite sure, just not quite sure, you know, who the father is. Well, they weren't, were they? I didn't have any idea who the father was. Isn't this Mary's son? And then, look, he's just bogan. And the topic that had been suggested was he is just ordinary, you know, faith in the face of ordinariness. But I've chose to change the name of that topic because it's basically in the face of offensiveness. And here we've got this lovely man, 30 years old or 30 plus now. He's come back and he's stepping out in ministry for his father, his genuine father. And this is what the population says to him. And so that is their reaction. And I guess I would summarise it. If we were from the same village, we'd say, look, he's not cut from the right cloth to be Israel's deliverer. I mean, how could he be Israel's deliverer if he's a bastard? How could he be Israel's deliverer if he's had no formal education? How could he be? He just can't be. And that's what got them. They just could not handle the combination of what they had heard he had been doing and observed him doing elsewhere, apparently. They just couldn't handle it. It was too much for them. And so their minds were closed as they examined the data. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so what is the result? We see it here, the final reaction of his hometown. I was going to say just before that when you think about it, there's an irony in the fact that Jesus did grow up in that area, because King David was the same. You know, the first proper king of Israel. I mean, he'd come from being a farmer himself, and he went on to great things. And I will say this too, because I've got it in my notes, and I've from that previous slide, being a trade teacher, you know, I can remember teaching the repeat class on Friday afternoon. One of my mates used to call them the Krispy Kremes. And so, but not to their face. Oh, they wouldn't have got it anyhow, but it's all right. I used to call them the Krispy Kremes. Anyhow, as I was preparing this, a little bit of Banjo Patterson came into my mind about the man from Ironbark. And so talking about this whole bogan thing, about this society, there were some gilded youths that sat along the barber's wall. Their eyes were dull. Their heads were flat. They had no brains at all. And this bogan idea of Jesus being like this, from this backwater community, And yet we know who we're talking about today. And his hometown and his family, he goes on to say that, it wouldn't cut with them. They couldn't work it out. And so they took offence at him. And that word offence, they were scandalised. And that's a Greek word. And it's basically just talking about what a definition. Actually, I got this definition from a Greek scholar called Kenneth West. I've got his books at home and I quite like him. But he said, that this is his translation of that passage, and they saw in him that of which they disapproved and which kept them from acknowledging him. Now, what was it? What was it? What was it in their culture and their understanding of Jesus and the understanding of who they were themselves that basically caused this problem for them? But they were offended. Now, Tim Keller, in his stuff on this particular passage, he says their reaction was visceral. And so, I looked up, just a definition of the word visceral and put it there, that feelings that are felt very deeply, difficult to control or ignore, and are not the result of thought. And see, that is an interesting response, isn't it? And he goes on basically to talk about pride. But I think before the pride comes prejudice, and I'm sorry about that as well, but before the pride comes prejudice. And so how do I respond to Jesus is the question that Keller asks. And he says the world is offended by Jesus. The world is offended by Jesus, and it doesn't matter which part of the world that we look at. I thought just at this point too, this came to mind just before I go to Tim Keller's application on this, from Hebrews, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathise with our weaknesses, but one who has been tried and tested as we are, sin apart, yet without sin. And you think of Jesus in this circumstance, being rejected and offending his family and his community, his home community, and what that must have meant for him as a man. Now we know he's God, but what it must have meant for him as a man. It was one of those times that were very difficult in his life, very, very difficult. And so with with respect to Tim Keller, I've changed his material a little bit because I'm not as what word did you use about Tim Keller, Russell? Was it?
What did I say?
Yeah, you said about he's very articulate.
Oh, articulate.
Yeah. So this is a Rosticulate sort of understanding of Tim, and I've just pulled some of his information and sort of packed it in this particular way. And so his basic, he has a number of comments. It's actually worth reading his sermons if they're around, you know. So it's actually worth listening to, especially his second one. He says that the world, and this is an application of this particular topic, that the world is offended by Jesus, but not in the same way. That you can go to various cultures and find that those cultures will be offended by Jesus from a different perspective. And each of them has to do with prejudice. A lot of it, all of it has to do with culture, and the culture has been mentioned a number of times today. All of it has to do with culture, and it is our cultural background that basically determines what our prejudices are. You think about that, and it's a very wise observation about life. And so my boss at work, now he was a bogan, you know, like a long time ago, very clever man, very capable man. He was a surfer, he was in Coffs Harbour. He said he reckons he could sit on his hair. He never wore shoes until he was a certain age. As I said, very clever man. I can remember walking down the corridor with him, and him, I don't know why, having this visceral reaction as he spoke to me about religion. And it wasn't a rational comment, it was just absolutely visceral, and he was almost shaking in his voice as he told me it was a load of crap. And I mean, that's his Western culture, and that's what he has grown up with, and what he's been exposed to through school and through social media and all the rest of it. And so none of us is exempt from the prejudices that we've absorbed in time, and we never gave time to think about these things, and so we can't become offended and basically reject him out of hand because it's all stupid or useless or whatever. And so it doesn't matter whether our culture is Islamic or Western or Hindu or Buddhist, the way that we will be offended could be quite different. And so Keller gives some articulately, gives some very, sort of this arguments, but I've sort of been a little bit more, squares and triangles and stuff with this. We've got a lady that is a friend of Patricia and myself. She's an older lady. She's a German. Her dad was fighting in the Second World War. She prayed to God. Her mum prayed to God that he would bring her father home, and he brought her father home, and that was her first step of faith. And so we've been working, Patricia especially has been working with this lady for a good night. She's quite old. And she says, I understand God. I understand God, but I can't handle this born again thing. And so that's a prejudice that she has. And so it's a question that we need to think about, and so I don't get the born again thing. Now we know that God's Spirit has to do that, and so we pray for that. So depending on who we are, we basically determine our reaction or our response, and our prejudice, and then our pride, which stops us from responding because we don't want to give in to that sort of stuff. It's if you like, the lordship of Jesus. And so if we take the Christian perspective here, my faith is the only way to God. Now that's what we say. The Bible says this: salvation is found in no one else, for is there no other name given under heaven by which we must be saved. Now, which other culture would be offended by that? There's only one way to God. Give me some examples. I mean, can you think of any of the world religions where they would say, "Oh no, I don't think I could accept that"? Hindu. And so if I'm talking with somebody who's a Hindu, that could possibly be a prejudice. It could be something that I need to work out. Even if I'm talking to a Westerner, if we say, "Oh no, there's only one way to God, it's through Jesus," but what about all other faiths? There's more than one way up the hill to God, and so that's a Western perspective on this, and we've got to think, well, aren't you being a little bit, that's offensive to say there's only one way to God, and that's what you Christians believe. And Christianity is a Western religion. If you're talking about Middle East and Asia, it's a Western religion, and it's you bring in Western values in. And so these are things that we need to worry about as far as Tim Keller is concerned. So a Muslim might agree and say, yes, of course there's only one way to God, but to the Christian you'll say you're using the wrong book. Because you're using the Bible, we use the Quran. And so it is worth considering, isn't it? There's the background of culture with some of the Eastern, we're just talking about the Eastern values, it's extended family. We're so independent and not so interdependent, and so I could make a decision and it's going to dishonour my family. And so there's another thing that's going on there. That's a prejudice or something that trips the person up simply because. Then the second thing that the Christian faith says is, it's more than these things, but these are just three that Keller sort of partially mentions. For it's by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, it's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Well, we have some friends come to our church at the moment who are Buddhist, and they have an interest in Christian things. They don't come to church, they actually come after church for coffee, and which is okay. But he comes in and he stacks the chairs. And I think he's doing that because he's trying to achieve some karma in a religious place. Now, I haven't asked him that yet, and I won't ask him that because I'll offend him, you know. But the whole idea of you must earn your salvation in Buddhism is the ultimate is when you are good enough, you ascend to the next level, you know, and you move on and you move on until you reach nirvana. And so the whole world is offended by Jesus, but not necessarily from the same perspective is the point that I'm just trying to make. And so living my faith calls me to love God and others unconditionally. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Now, what would an honour-based society say about that? You mean all that rubbish about turning the other cheek and giving 70 times 7 and Matthew 18 as we had? No way. That's offensive. You mean that as far as the second one, you mean that like some serial killer can just come to God and confess their sin and be saved, and here I'm doing all these good works, and that person can get into heaven and I can't, or they get in, and I don't want to be with them. You know, this thinking, they're prejudices that are there that we don't think about. We don't think about as we're talking with other people about our faith. And so there's a couple of points I want to make in conclusion. Mark's gospel is telling us who Jesus is. Now, in the case of this passage, we find out who Jesus is. As Peter summarises it, he's a stone of stumbling and a rock of offence. When Simeon spoke to Mary in the temple, he said to her privately, interestingly enough, in Luke chapter 2 and 34, if you want to look it up, this child is destined to cause many in Israel to fall, but he'll bring joy to many others. He sent as a sign from God that many will oppose him. And so, I mean, that is about Israel, but here's this sense, this stress that is here with Jesus. He is offensive to all of us. And even as believers, he is offensive to us at times because there's stuff we haven't worked out yet. And we think, no way. That is just too offensive for me to even consider. And so we see Jesus, you know, when just this last section, and I said about the humanity of Jesus, just who he is as a man. Look at this. For those who respond negatively and refuse to have relationship with him, prideful prejudice obstructs Jesus. And so if I am prejudiced against him because it's just too much, and I am proudly not prepared to be humble, as Steve was talking about, and how that came through in the theme today, Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honour except in his hometown, among his relatives, and even in his own home. He could not do any miracles there. You know, he couldn't bring change in their lives. And here he was the hometown boy. He had potential to do all of this. It was there at his fingertips. And they were unbelieving. He could not do any miracles except lay hands and afflict sick people. And what is the response of Jesus? It's not the same word as amazed as before. He was marveled. He marvelled. He was surprised that they were like this. Just closed to who he was. And yet, in contrast, humble submission invites the blessing of Jesus. Humble submission invites the blessing of Jesus, because Jesus said to his disciples in another time in Matthew 11:6, he says, "Blessed is the one who is not offended by me." And that was the title to this topic. And we've got a choice. If we're prepared not to be offended by Jesus and embrace his values and his ways, then basically we get the blessing. I mean, it's one of the Beatitudes. It's not in the Beatitudes itself, like Sermon on the Mount Beatitudes, but it's a beatitude. It's a blessing that Jesus offers. He says, "Blessed is the one who is not offended by me." I think I got this quote from somewhere else, but it's Bruce. I assume it's F.F. Bruce. Honest inquiry is a sovereign cure for prejudice. And I think that's a really clear and good statement. Honest inquiry. Let's research this and think about this and take some time to reflect. Do a Siwa thing. Honest inquiry is a sovereign cure for prejudice. Now, just a thought, the takeaway thought for today, practical. I did training in evangelism explosion. We did 4 spiritual laws and all that sort of stuff. And one of the clarifying questions for evangelism explosion is, if you were to die today and you were to stand before God and he was to say to you, "Why should I let you into my heaven?" what would you say? Now, it's a really good clarification question, but it's sort of up here. I think this question that we've been, Keller actually has been discussing with us, has quite a practical application to the way we do evangelism in the culture, where we're becoming more and more cross-cultural. And basically, what is it that offends you about Jesus and his good news message? I think that might be a good place to start at times with people. What is it? Just tell me what offends you about Jesus. I'd like to know. Tell me what offends you about his message. Let's pray. Father, we love you. We just really appreciate the way that you sent Jesus, and he was tested and tried as we are. And Jesus, we thank you for what you have done for us, for putting up with all this rubbish that you did in order to show grace and extend mercy to us. Amen.